The air inside Dusthaven's courthouse was heavy with dust, sweat, and the low hum of whispers, as if the entire town had gathered not for justice, but for entertainment, their eyes fixed on the lone woman at the front of the room. Clara Vey stood stiffly at the defendant's table, her hands pressed against the scarred wood so tightly her knuckles whitened, her bonnet slipping sideways to reveal strands of hair damp with fear, her gray dress rumpled from a sleepless night. Across from her, Silas Crane, the wealthiest ranch boss for 50 miles, and feared more than the sheriff himself, leaned back smugly in his chair, while his lawyer fired accusation after accusation, words sharpened like knives: fraud, theft, deceit, forgery. The claim was that Clara had doctored her late husband's deed to steal land Silas said belonged to him. And the crowd, hungry for scandal, murmured in agreement, eager to see a widow stripped of dignity. The judge, an old man with weary eyes and a Bible lying open on the bench before him, listened with furrowed brow, though Clara knew that Silas's coin had often made his decisions easier. When she tried to speak, her voice trembled. "My husband worked that land, every fence, every acre," but she was cut off by a sneer from Silas's lawyer and laughter that rippled through the benches. Clara's chest ached with humiliation, the injustice pressing down until her knees felt weak, but she forced herself to stand straighter because she had promised her husband as he lay dying that she would not let their home be stolen. Still, the whispers burned. "She's lying. She's desperate. She's nothing but a cheat." She swallowed hard, feeling the hollowness of standing alone, and when she dared look toward the crowd, even familiar faces turned away, unwilling to risk Crane's wrath by siding with her. Then, when it seemed no one would stand for her, the heavy doors at the back of the courthouse creaked open, the sound cutting through the noise like a blade. Every head turned as Elias Boone entered, his tall frame outlined against the bright morning light, boots striking the floorboards in a rhythm that seemed to echo through every chest in the room. Known more for silence than speech, Elias had lived on his own ranch for years, his name often spoken with quiet respect, though he had never sought power. He walked straight down the aisle without pause, the crowd parting instinctively until he stopped beside Clara at the defendant's table. His presence alone sent a ripple of unease across Silas's face, but what came next stole the breath from the room. Slowly, deliberately, Elias reached out, placing his calloused hand on the open Bible before the judge, directly beside Clara's trembling one. The hush that followed was absolute, as if the air itself had stilled, and in that silence Elias's voice, gravel deep and steady, rolled out like thunder. "She's not alone." Clara gasped softly, her heart pounding, as he straightened to face Silas, eyes sharp as flint. Then he added words that struck like a hammer against the lies piled in the room. "And I've got the ledger that will damn the real thief." The crowd erupted in gasps and shouts, half in disbelief, half in awe, and even the judge leaned forward, suddenly attentive. Silas's smugness faltered, his jaw tightening as his fingers twitched against the arm of his chair, because in that single moment the tide of the courtroom had shifted, and Clara, who had stood alone in shame, now had a defender whose presence made the very walls tremble. The murmur in the courthouse swelled into a storm of voices after Elias Boone's words fell like a thunderclap, women clutching their shawls tighter, men leaning forward with wide eyes, and the judge pounding his gavel repeatedly to restore order. But Elias did not flinch, his hand still steady on the Bible, his gaze locked on Silas Crane, as if daring him to breathe wrong. Slowly, Elias reached into the leather satchel slung across his shoulder, the creak of its buckle loud in the tense silence, and withdrew a thick, weathered ledger, its cover scuffed and corners curled from years of use. a book that carried the weight of every dishonest deal Silas had ever hidden. "This," Elias said, lifting it high so the light caught its worn edges, "is the record of every ranch hand's pay, every widow's debt, every acre signed away under false claim. And it shows whose hand guided the theft." Gasps rippled through the benches, and Clara's lips parted, disbelief and hope clashing in her chest as she looked at Elias like he had stepped out of a dream. Silas shifted in his chair, his smug expression cracking into something darker, his lawyer rising quickly with a shout. "Objection! This is nonsense! Evidence fabricated to sway an ignorant crowd." The judge raised a hand, silencing him, but his brow furrowed as though weighing the political cost of daring to read what Elias held. Silas's voice slithered over the crowd, smoother than his lawyer's but more venomous. "Boone, you don't know what you're stepping into. That land is mine by right, and you'll damn yourself if you meddle." Elias's jaw tightened, the flicker of controlled rage in his eyes enough to silence even the boldest heckler. "You've lived fat off lies," he growled, "while this woman you hounded kept her children fed with scraps. You forged debts to bury the weak, but your ink doesn't bleed as deep as truth." He set the ledger down on the judge's bench, the thump echoing like a gunshot, and with deliberate hands flipped it open to a page marked in his rough scrawl. The entries were neat, yet damning, a column of names with debts crossed and rewritten in Silas's unmistakable hand, signatures overwritten, amounts doubled, the trail of a man who thought no one would look twice. The judge leaned forward, adjusting his spectacles, lips pursed as his finger traced the marks. Gasps rose again as some in the crowd recognized the names. Neighbors, brothers, fathers, all cheated. A blacksmith's widow clutched her mouth and whispered, "That's my Tom's land," while another man shouted, "He stole my grazing rights." Silas surged to his feet, fists balled, his voice booming over the growing outrage. "Enough! That book is stolen! Boone is nothing but a recluse who envies my success. He and the widow have conspired to ruin me with lies." He turned toward the judge, his eyes gleaming with desperation beneath the mask of fury. "This circus is beneath the law. End it now!" But Elias's voice cut sharper than the gavel's crack. "I found this ledger in your own foreman's trunk, left behind when he fled the state. He confessed before he died of fever that the books he kept were yours, and the ink stains on his fingers were paid for with your silver." The crowd exploded, shouts overlapping until the rafters trembled, women crying out for justice, men slamming their fists on benches, and the judge himself forced to strike the gavel again and again, his voice breaking as he demanded silence. Clara gripped the table, her chest heaving as tears blurred her vision, because for the first time since her husband's death, the truth had been spoken aloud by someone who stood beside her, someone who carried her shame as if it were his own. Silas, pale with fury, spat toward Elias and snarled, "You'll regret this. You think you can turn a town against me? You'll bury yourself with that widow before I let a book end me." Elias met his glare without flinching, his hand still steady on the open Bible. "Better to bury myself in truth than live fat on your lies," he said. And in that moment, the crowd's allegiance shifted like dry grass catching flame. No longer jeering at Clara but staring at Silas Crane as if finally seeing the thief in daylight. The courthouse, now trembling under the weight of voices calling for justice, grew tense again as the gavel struck repeatedly, and the judge's lined face grew harder, though his eyes slid often to Silas Crane, whose scowl carried more than rage. It carried promises of power and coin that had long shaped the law of Dusthaven. Clara's heart hammered as she clutched the table, sensing the shift. For though Elias's ledger had stirred the crowd, the final decision still rested with a man whose purse had been filled by Silas more than once, and she feared that truth alone might not outweigh gold. Silas, regaining some of his composure, leaned close to the bench, his voice low but carrying. "Your Honor, surely you see the farce here. A widow's tears and a hermit rancher's theatrics can't be permitted to undermine property law. I'm prepared to settle this matter generously, to ensure the court's time isn't wasted." The whisper of bribery slithered through the air, and the judge's lips tightened, though he did not rebuke it, instead tapping his fingers on the open Bible, a rhythm that sounded less like prayer and more like hesitation. Elias's voice broke through, sharp, unyielding. "Judge Alcott, look at those pages. Names of widows, farmers, children's guardians, all robbed while Crane grew fat. If you bury this, you bury not just her home, but the faith of every man and woman who still believes the law is worth more than coin." His hand pressed harder on the Bible, and his gaze swept the room, catching the eyes of those who had suffered under Silas. A blacksmith rose, his voice quaking. "That ledger shows my brother's ranch stolen. If you throw it out, you damn us all." Others followed, voices rising, women crying out, "He took our land," and "We want truth, not bribes." The judge's gavel slammed again, but his authority faltered under the tide of outrage. Silas snarled, whipping toward the crowd. "You think Boone cares for you? He hides on his patch of dirt while I employ your sons, feed your cattle, keep this town alive. Without me, Dusthaven starves." His words, meant to intimidate, sparked fresh anger, and Elias stepped forward, slamming his fist onto the bench beside the Bible, the sound silencing even the restless judge. "You feed this town with chains," Elias growled. "Every acre you own bleeds with the sweat of men who never saw fair pay. Every widow you drove from her home still haunts these benches. I won't let you strip another soul bare while you fatten your purse." Silas's lawyer interjected, sweat dripping from his brow. "Your Honor, this is slander. Wild tales from a bitter man. Dismiss this charade before it becomes a riot." But Clara, summoning courage she thought gone, lifted her trembling voice, steadying as the words left her lips. "My husband worked those fields until fever took him. Silas came 2 days after the burial, waiving debts he never owed. I begged for time, for mercy, but he brought men to drag me from my own door. If this is law, then let me hang. But I will not call it justice." Her words cracked the air like a whip, and silence spread, heavy, as the judge leaned back, the crowd's faces burning into him like fire. Silas hissed, stepping closer to the bench, his tone venomous. "Remember who put you there, Alcott. Remember whose hand built your house and paid your debts. Condemn me, and you condemn yourself." For a moment the judge's gaze faltered, the gavel pausing mid-air, the weight of temptation clear in his eyes. But Elias Boone did not move, his hand never leaving the Bible, his voice rising with unshakable resolve. "If you condemn her, then condemn me as well. I swear before God and man, I will stand beside her until my last breath, ledger in my hand, truth on my tongue. And if you sell your verdict for coin, this town will know whose soul was cheapest." The benches erupted in shouts, the walls shaking with fury and hope mingled, and the judge, caught between greed and fear of his people, found himself no longer the master of the room, but its prisoner, as Clara's tears turned to steel at the sight of Elias, unyielding by her side. The courthouse doors banged open again, and the sound echoed like a gunshot through the rafters as Silas Crane, face contorted with fury yet sharpened with cunning, motioned for 2 men to step inside, both gaunt ranch hands who had long worked under his thumb, their shoulders hunched, their eyes darting nervously beneath the brim of their hats. "These men," Silas declared with a flourish, "will tell you the truth of Clara Vey and her so-called claim. They have lived under my employ, seen the books with their own eyes, and will testify that this widow forged her husband's deed to steal what was mine." The judge, still rattled but leaning toward the lifeline of order, gestured for the men to come forward, his gavel tapping weakly as if begging for control. The first witness, a wiry fellow named Dobbs, swallowed hard before speaking. His voice thin and shaking. I seen the papers, Your Honor. It weren't Silas that forged them. It was her. She wanted more than her husband left. His words fell like cold stones, but his eyes betrayed fear, darting toward Silas, who stood just behind him with a hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol, the unspoken threat more binding than any oath. Murmurs swelled through the benches, some gasping, others shaking their heads. But Clara's knees buckled at the lie, her hand clutching the table until her knuckles turned white. Elias stepped forward, his voice low but carrying like distant thunder. "Dobbs, you swore to me once in private that Crane's men beat you for asking about missing pay. You said his ink cost you your land. Now you stand here and say otherwise? Whose truth are you selling, yours or his?" Dobbs's throat worked, his gaze falling. But before he could stammer, Silas barked, "Answer the question, boy. Tell the court she's the thief." The man flinched, then nodded weakly. "It was her, I swear." A hiss ran through the benches, a snake of disbelief winding around the room. But Silas wasn't finished. He beckoned the second man, a heavier fellow named Pike, whose eyes were glassy with drink and fear. "I was there," Pike slurred, "when she begged me to change the deed. She offered me coin, said her husband owed nothing, but she wanted Crane's land for her own." Clara gasped, a cry breaking from her lips. "That's a lie!" But the judge's gavel struck sharply, silencing her. Elias moved with the strength of a storm, striding up to Pike, his shadow falling over the man as his voice rumbled, "Show the coin, then. Show the payment she supposedly gave you. Or will you confess it was Crane who filled your cup last night?" Pike faltered, sweat breaking on his brow, but Silas's glare bore into him, freezing his tongue. The crowd shifted uneasily, whispers rising, some siding with the witnesses, others shaking their heads at the obvious strings being pulled. Elias turned to the judge, his voice steady but blazing with conviction. "Your Honor, these men are bought with fear and whiskey. Their words are worth no more than the silver in Crane's purse. If this is the evidence you accept, then every man in this room is guilty of whatever Silas pays to call truth." Clara straightened, her tears drying to fire, her voice trembling but strong. "I have nothing to offer but my husband's sweat, my children's hunger, and my own name. If that isn't enough for justice, then no woman in this town is safe." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the shuffle of feet and the pounding of hearts, until from the back of the room a voice rang out, an old ranch widow shouting, "Dobbs, Pike, you know the truth. I seen Crane's men with my own eyes, burning the deeds of those who couldn't pay." The benches erupted, voices layering, some for Clara, some for Silas, until the courthouse seemed to quake with division, and the judge, caught in the middle, slammed his gavel again and again, shouting for silence. But though Silas's witnesses had spoken, their lies hung in the air like smoke, and everyone could see the flames that had lit them came not from Clara's hand, but from the man who now smiled like a wolf, who thought he'd turned the tide. The courthouse walls seemed to groan under the weight of voices, half the crowd jeering Clara as a fraud, the other half muttering that Silas's men spoke with coin in their mouths, and the judge, his gavel striking in vain, shouted for order, though his own voice wavered like a man standing on thin ice. Silas Crane leaned back with a smug smile, confident he had steered the tide, while Clara sagged at the table, despair dragging her shoulders low, her mind whispering that even Elias's strength could not break lies bought with fear. Then, from the far corner of the room where the sunlight cut in a single narrow shaft, a frail cough echoed, weak but sharp enough to slice through the noise, and every head turned toward a figure pushing up from the benches. It was Jeremiah Hobbs, Silas's former foreman, gaunt and pale, his frame trembling as if the fever that had nearly claimed him had left nothing but bones and resolve, and in his shaking hands he carried a small wooden box bound with frayed leather straps. The crowd gasped, whispers darting like wildfire, for Jeremiah had vanished months ago, rumored dead or fled, and now he stepped forward on unsteady legs, his eyes burning with the fire of a man who had nothing left to lose. "I got something to say," he rasped, voice thin but hard with truth, "and I'll say it before God and man." Silas surged upright, his face draining of color before twisting into rage. "You were paid to disappear, Hobbs," he barked, but the old foreman only laughed, a dry rattle that chilled the room. "Paid, aye, to keep silent. But fever took my body and near took my soul, and I ain't meeting the Lord with lies on my tongue." He staggered toward the bench, setting the box down with a thump, his fingers fumbling with the straps until the lid fell open, spilling across the judge's desk a pile of crumpled pages, receipts, and letters inked with Silas Crane's hand. Elias's eyes flared as he stepped closer, recognizing the same script that marred the ledger, false debts scribbled across names, land seized through fraud, wages docked until families starved. "This here," Jeremiah croaked, pointing with a trembling hand, "is the copy ledger. I made 2 of every page he forced me to forge, 1 for him, 1 for me. Thought it might save me one day, and by God, today's the day." The courtroom erupted, shouts and gasps colliding, women weeping with sudden hope, men rising to see the papers, while Silas lunged forward, spittle flying from his mouth as he roared, "Lies! All lies! He's a dying drunk trying to ruin me." But Jeremiah's eyes glittered with the clarity of truth as he fixed them on the judge. "I wrote those numbers. I watched him cheat widows, steal land, and call it lawful. Every mark was made by my hand at his order. You want to know the thief? There he stands, fat on stolen bread." The judge's face, pale and sweating, shifted as his hand hovered over the documents, the gavel frozen in midair. Elias placed his palm firmly on the Bible again, his voice carrying like rolling thunder. "You can't bury this now. God's witness has spoken, man's witness has bled on these pages, and the truth has come out of Crane's own house." Clara's tears spilled freely, but her back straightened as hope surged into her chest for the first time in months. While Silas, cornered, his mask slipping, spat curses at Jeremiah and Elias alike, his voice cracking with desperation. The crowd roared, cries of "Hang him!" mixing with "Justice at last," until the courthouse trembled like a barn in a storm, and the judge, caught between his purse and his people, realized with dread that Silas's power was no longer unchallenged, for the shock of Jeremiah's return and the damning weight of his proof had cracked open the walls of Dusthaven's law, leaving truth blazing in the open where no coin could easily smother it. The courthouse had barely steadied from the shock of Jeremiah Hobbs's testimony when Silas Crane erupted with the ferocity of a cornered animal, his bulk lunging across the aisle as if sheer force could shatter the truths laid bare in the old foreman's box. And before anyone could react, his fist slammed into Jeremiah's chest, sending the frail man sprawling against the bench, papers scattering like startled birds into the air. Gasps and screams tore through the room as women clutched their mouths and men half rose from the benches, torn between fear of Silas's wrath and rage at the sight of violence within the very house of law. The judge's gavel struck wildly, his voice shrill. "Order! This is a court of law!" But Silas's roar drowned him out, spittle flying as he bellowed, "This man's a liar! This court's a sham! I'll not have my life's work dragged into the dirt by thieves and cowards!" His lawyer scrambled uselessly, hands outstretched to calm him, but the sight of Jeremiah, coughing blood onto the floorboards, silenced every attempt at justification. Clara, frozen a heartbeat too long, suddenly surged forward with a cry, her hands reaching for Jeremiah as if to shield him, while Elias Boone moved with grim purpose, seizing Silas by the shoulder and yanking him back, his voice low but lethal. "Touch him again, and you'll answer to me before you answer to God." Silas twisted, his face blotched with rage, shoving against Elias with surprising strength, their boots scraping across the floor as the crowd shouted, half urging Elias to strike, half too terrified of Silas's grip on the town to cheer aloud. Jeremiah groaned, clutching his chest, his voice rasping through the commotion. "Don't let him bury it! Don't let him—" while his trembling hand reached for the papers scattered like autumn leaves around him. Elias stooped, scooping up a handful, raising them high for all to see, his voice ringing. "Here is proof enough. Wages halved, debts doubled, signatures forged. These pages scream louder than any witness Silas can break." The room erupted again, fury boiling, and Silas, wild-eyed, jerked free long enough to snatch at the documents, but Elias's fist crashed into his jaw with the inevitability of a falling hammer, sending the ranch boss staggering back against the rail as the crowd erupted in gasps. The judge stood, white as chalk, his gavel clattering uselessly to the desk as he shouted for deputies, but they hesitated. Glancing between Silas and the mob that now pressed forward, their loyalty wavering as they weighed their own fates. Silas spat blood, his voice ragged but still defiant. "You think a book and a dying man can undo me? I own this town. I own the land you sit on, the food you eat, the graves you'll be buried in." His words, instead of cowing, ignited fury. Farmers rose, women shouted, men slammed fists to benches, and a cry began to build. "Read the pages! Read the pages!" until it thundered from wall to wall. Elias, chest heaving, turned to Clara, pressing the stack of papers into her hands, his eyes fierce. "Hold these! Don't let them go!" She clutched them to her chest like a newborn, her tears replaced with fire, as Jeremiah, pale and shaking, whispered from the floor, "Truth don't die easy, not even when Silas Crane strikes it down." Deputies finally surged forward, not toward Elias or Clara, but toward Silas himself, grappling his arms as he kicked and spat. And for the first time in memory, the people of Dusthaven saw him not as a lord, but as a man unmasked, thrashing desperately as the truth he had buried clawed its way into daylight. The deputies dragged Silas Crane back toward the rail, iron cuffs clamped on his wrists, the clatter of metal ringing strange and heavy in a room where his word had once carried more weight than law itself. Yet even shackled, he did not bow, his head lifted defiantly, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth as his eyes burned with venom that seemed to scorch whoever dared look upon him. The crowd pressed close, whispers swelling into chants of, "Read the papers, read the papers," while the judge sat frozen behind his bench, his gavel forgotten, his hand trembling near the open Bible as though the holy book itself had grown too hot to touch. Clara stood at the front, clutching the stack of damning documents, her chest rising and falling like a woman who had carried both death and life in her arms. Yet her knees quaked at the sight of Silas's sneer, even as deputies forced him to his seat. "Think you've won, widow?" he spat, his voice hoarse but dripping with venom. "You and Boone will be nothing but dust before winter's done. My men still ride free. My coin still flows through every store, every church, every hand that feeds this town. You may have papers, but I have roots. Pull me out here and the whole town starves." The words slithered through the benches, fear flickering in some faces as memories of debts, jobs, and cattle tied to Silas's name returned like chains around their throats. The judge cleared his throat, his eyes darting nervously to the crowd, then to Silas, then to the trembling papers clutched in Clara's hands. "These documents," he said, his voice wavering like old wood in the wind, "may or may not be admissible given their origin. Without proper seal, without sworn witness." His hesitation spread like cold water, murmurs rising again, hope faltering, and Clara felt her throat tighten, the old helplessness rushing back until Elias stepped forward, his boots striking the floor with steady thunder. "You've seen enough," he told the judge, his voice a growl of unbending will, "and so has everyone here. You call them inadmissible. Then you declare to God and man that your law is weaker than a thief's purse. Is that what you want carved on your grave, Judge Alcott? That you sold truth cheap because Silas Crane bought your silence?" His words burned, and the crowd stirred, cries of "Read them!" rising again, yet the judge's gaze still flickered, caught between conscience and coin. Silas, chains clinking as he shifted, leaned forward, a slow smile twisting his battered face. "Boone, you're loud today, but when my riders come down from the hills tonight, let's see how long your truth lasts when fire takes your cattle and your barn with them. And you, Clara." His eyes darted to her trembling frame, his voice a hiss. "Your children's bellies will remember my name when no bread reaches their mouths. I built this town on hunger, and I can starve it again." Clara's breath caught, terror coiling around her heart, the memory of nights she had fed her children crusts while Silas's wagons rolled past heavy with grain burning like fresh scars. But when she looked down at the papers in her arms, her fear shifted into something harder. "I will not starve in silence again," she whispered, voice breaking but fierce, and the crowd caught it. The words carried on a rising tide until men and women shouted their agreement, stamping feet, pounding benches, their roar filling the courthouse like a storm breaking free of the plains. The judge recoiled at the noise, sweat beading his brow, his trembling hand finally reaching out toward the scattered evidence, as though the choice could no longer be delayed. Silas strained against his cuffs, snarling, "You'll all hang with me before this is over!" But his voice was drowned by the thunder of the people, the widows, the farmers, the orphans whose names filled the ledger, their demand shaking the rafters with one relentless cry, "Justice! Justice!" The roar of the crowd rattled the rafters as "Justice! Justice!" thundered in waves, and the judge, pale and trembling, reached at last toward the heap of papers Clara clutched, his hand shaking as if each inch closer to the truth burned him hotter than fire. But as Clara laid the bundle on the bench, something slipped loose from the stack, a page folded twice and hidden between two ledgers, yellowed more than the rest, its edges brittle as though someone had meant for it never to be found. She bent quickly, scooping it up, her heart hammering strangely as her eyes fell upon handwriting she knew better than her own. It was her late husband Samuel's. Her breath caught as she unfolded the page, her lips moving silently over the words, and then a gasp tore from her chest so raw that even Elias turned, alarm flashing in his eyes. "It's Samuel's hand," she whispered, her voice trembling as the crowd fell quiet, straining to hear. She held the paper high, her tears making the ink blur, but she read aloud, each word cutting through the air like a blade. "If I die, it is not fever that claims me but betrayal. Silas Crane pressed me to sign what was not mine, and I refused. He threatened Clara, he threatened the children. If this note is found, then know my blood stains his hands as surely as ink stains his books." The courtroom gasped as one, the benches groaning under the weight of bodies leaning forward, women crying out, men swearing under their breath, and even the judge dropped his gavel, the wood clattering across the floor as though the very law had slipped from his grasp. Clara's knees nearly buckled, for though the words vindicated her, they also confirmed what her heart had long dreaded, that Samuel had not died merely of fever but of treachery, and his last act had been to shield her from a truth too terrible to carry alone. Silas, bound though he was, surged against his chains, his face purple with rage, shouting, "Forged! That note's a lie! Boone wrote it himself! The widow fakes her own husband's hand to sway you fools." But even as he barked, the crowd hissed, for many had known Samuel Vey, a quiet man whose handwriting marked every supply order in town. And more than one voice called out, "That's Samuel's script, clear as day." The judge's face blanched, his hand clutching the edge of the bench as though the floor had dropped beneath him, and Elias stepped forward, his voice steady but deep with the weight of what had been revealed. "It's his dying testimony." Judge Alcott, "You can't bury it, you can't dismiss it, not without declaring that a man's last words mean nothing in Dusthaven." Clara's tears streamed down her face. Grief and fury tangled in her chest as she stared at Silas, her voice rising into a scream she hadn't known lived in her. "You killed him, didn't you? You stole his life because you couldn't steal his land." The crowd erupted again, farmers and widows shouting, "Murderer, thief," until deputies strained to hold them back, and Silas, wild-eyed, bellowed over them all, "I built this town. You'll all rot without me. His death was nothing, dust in the wind." But his words, once feared, now rang hollow in the storm of voices condemning him. Jeremiah Hobbs, pale and barely breathing from where he sat hunched on the floor, croaked weakly. "He poisoned Sam. I saw him pour the cup myself, and I kept my mouth shut out of fear, but no longer." Gasps tore through the room again, the crowd surging with fury, and even the deputies restraining Silas recoiled in disgust as the realization spread like fire through dry grass. This was no longer a case of forged deeds or stolen acres, but of blood spilled in the shadows, a husband betrayed, a widow left to starve, and a town blinded by greed. And now, with Samuel's last words in her trembling hands, Clara felt the weight shift from survival to vengeance, for what had begun as a fight to keep her home had become a reckoning for her husband's very life. And she swore silently that the court would not end until the man who had robbed her children of their father was stripped bare before them all. The revelation of Samuel's note had cracked the courthouse like a thunderclap, and even as the crowd surged with fury, stamping and shouting for Silas Crane's blood, the man in chains did not shrink, but seemed to swell, his shoulders heaving with rage, his eyes burning with the madness of a cornered wolf. And when the deputies tried to force him back down, he wrenched upright, the cuffs biting into his wrists as he bellowed, "You think words on paper, damn me! You think the whimper of a dying man and the babble of a drunk foreman can strip me of what I built? I am Dusthaven. Without me you starve, without me your cattle rot, without me the railroads turn their backs and the bankers close their doors." His voice shook the rafters, and for a heartbeat the room wavered, some faces paling as the truth of his grip on their livelihoods lingered. The reminder of debts owed and jobs tied to his hand pulling at their courage like invisible chains. Silas twisted further, his voice rising to a scream. "Burn me, and I'll burn you all. My riders wait in the hills. My barns are stocked while yours lie empty. I'll torch your fields. I'll choke your wells. I'll leave you crawling in dust until you beg for my scraps." The deputies faltered, fear flickering in their eyes, and even the judge, sweat streaming down his temple, leaned back in terror, his voice stammering, "Order! Order in the court!" But his gavel rang hollow. Clara's hands shook as she clutched Samuel's note to her chest, the weight of Silas's threats pressing against old wounds, memories of her children crying from hunger when he first drove her from her home, rising like ghosts. But before despair could take her, Elias Boone stepped forward, his frame casting a long shadow across the bench, his voice a deep rumble that silenced the mob's chaos. "You built nothing," he said, his words slow, deliberate, cutting through the air like steel. "You only stole what better men built and called it yours. You didn't feed this town, you bled it. You didn't raise homes, you burned them. And if your riders sit waiting to finish what you started, then let them come, because for once, this town will stand together instead of bowing to your chains." His hand fell heavy on the Bible, and the crowd leaned forward, caught in the weight of his conviction. Clara, her voice trembling but fierce, rose beside him, holding Samuel's words high for all to see. "This is not just paper. It is my husband's last breath, his warning, his plea. Silas Crane poisoned him. And if the law dares call this forgery, then let the people be the law today." Her cry struck the benches like fire poured on kindling, and suddenly voices rang out, not in whispers but in open defiance. "No more lies! We'll not be slaves to Crane! Read the names! Show the truth!" The courthouse trembled with the roar, and Silas's sneer faltered, his eyes darting as the weight of a town no longer cowed bore down on him. The judge, pale and shaking, tried to regain control, his gavel tapping uselessly as he stammered about procedure. But Elias turned on him, voice booming. "Your Honor, you've had years to weigh coin over truth. Today you'll weigh your own soul. Will you side with a murderer and thief, or with the people whose trust keeps your robe on your shoulders?" The judge's hand froze mid-air. Caught like a man staring down eternity, while Silas, desperate, shouted over the din, "I'll take you all to ruin before I fall! Mark me, Boone, mark me, widow! You'll bury your children beside your husbands before I bow!" But this time, the threat did not shackle. It sparked a fury that rattled the glass panes as men and women surged to their feet, fists pounding benches, a tide of defiance that even Silas Crane's riders in the hills would not withstand. And in that moment, as the courthouse thundered with rebellion, Clara realized Dusthaven was no longer Silas's town. It was theirs, if only they had the courage to seize it. The courthouse shook like a barn in a storm, the benches rattling under stomping feet, fists pounding, voices rising in one relentless wave, and in the chaos, Silas Crane moved with the speed of a man possessed, wrenching against the deputies at his side, his chains clattering furiously as he jerked free enough to drive a shoulder into one man's chest, sending him sprawling across the floorboards. Gasps and screams rose as Silas lunged for the doorway, dragging the weight of his cuffs with him, his hulking frame battering through startled townsfolk, knocking hats askew and sending papers flying. Clara cried out, clutching Samuel's letter tight against her chest, terror slicing through her as she realized that if Silas reached the outside, his riders could storm the town and burn the truth with fire and blood. Elias Boone moved instantly, boots striking hard, but Silas swung his shackled wrists like weapons, the iron cuffs smashing across Elias's temple with a sickening crack that sent him staggering, blood running down his cheek. "I'll bury you all," Silas roared, shoving a bench aside as if it weighed nothing, his voice a raw animal cry that carried above the tumult. The deputies scrambled after him, but fear slowed them, none daring to grapple with the madman head-on. Clara's knees trembled, her body screaming to hide, but her soul remembered Samuel's words, the ink that had burned her hands only moments before, and something inside her hardened like steel. She surged forward through the chaos, skirts tearing as she climbed the rail, her small frame blocking the doorway as Silas barreled toward her, his eyes bloodshot, foam at his mouth, his whole body a storm of hate. The crowd gasped, someone shouting, "Get back, Clara!" But she stood firm, holding the crumpled note aloft with shaking hands. "You can break me," she cried, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she had. "But you'll never bury his words, never bury the truth." Silas snarled, lunging, his shackled arms outstretched to crush her. But before he could strike, Elias Boone, blood pouring from his temple, hurled himself forward with a roar, slamming into Silas's side with the force of a charging bull. The two men crashed into the floor, the sound a thunderous crack as the chain links snapped against the boards. The crowd surged, men rushing to pile onto Silas, women screaming, deputies finally throwing themselves into the melee, and Clara, trembling, pressed Samuel's note against her chest, shielding it as though it were her very heartbeat. Silas roared and thrashed, his voice rising above the din. "You'll starve without me! You'll crawl in dust!" But the people shouted louder, drowning him out, voices that had once bent to his will now uniting as one. Elias grunted, straining against Silas's writhing bulk, his teeth clenched. "Not today, Crane. Not ever again." With a final heave, the deputies snapped new chains across Silas's wrists and ankles, his struggles weakening as sheer numbers forced him down, his body pinned, his threats still spilling but hollow now, a wolf caught in a cage. The crowd's roar grew deafening, cries of "justice" shaking the rafters, and Clara, her tears blurring the sight, felt the weight of years of silence lift from her shoulders. She staggered toward Elias, who knelt bleeding and breathless, and as their eyes met, she whispered, "You kept your word. You kept us safe." He touched her hand, calloused and trembling, pressing it against the note, his voice soft but sure even through the blood on his lips. "Samuel's truth will bury him deeper than any rope." The judge, pale and trembling, at last found his voice, declaring hoarsely that the evidence would be entered into record, the trial would continue, and Dusthaven's law would no longer belong to Silas Crane. The crowd erupted in a cheer that shook the windows, and though Silas spat curses, his voice was drowned beneath the thunder of freedom, as Clara stood tall in the doorway where he had tried to escape, clutching her husband's final words, her body shaking but her spirit ablaze with the knowledge that justice, at last, had begun to breathe. Silas Crane sat chained at the center of the courthouse, his shoulders heaving with fury, his once commanding presence diminished yet still dangerous, like a wolf foaming behind iron bars, but the power that had once bent Dusthaven to his will was breaking under the tide of voices swelling around him as one by one townsfolk began to rise, emboldened by the sight of Clara holding Samuel's final words aloft, and Elias Boone bleeding yet unbroken beside her. First came the blacksmith's widow, her shawl trembling around her thin shoulders as she stepped forward, her voice cracking yet fierce as she shouted, "He took my Tom's forge, doubled his debts, and left my children with nothing but ashes." Then a farmer with dust still clinging to his boots pushed through the crowd, waving a yellowed scrap of paper that matched the handwriting in the ledger, crying, "This mark here is mine, my land stolen with ink and threats while Silas laughed in my face." The benches rattled as more voices joined. Men and women who had long swallowed their pain out of fear, now spilling their stories like floodwaters breaking a dam, each testimony another stone piled onto Silas's grave. Jeremiah Hobbs, still frail but burning with final strength, lifted himself against the rail and rasped, "I kept his secrets too long, God forgive me, but I saw him bleed this town dry, and I swear it before heaven. Samuel Vey was poisoned for refusing his chains." Gasps and cries surged, the crowd shaking with rage, and the deputies who held Silas glanced nervously as his threats turned to frantic curses, his voice cracking as he shouted, "They lie. All of them. I gave you work. I gave you bread. You think Boone will feed your bellies? You think this widow can keep you from ruin?" But his words no longer carried fear, only bitterness, for the people who once bowed their heads now met his gaze with fire, their eyes no longer clouded by hunger but sharpened by truth. The judge, still pale, finally raised his gavel, but this time his voice steadied, as if the courage of the people had seeped into him. "Order! Order for justice!" he cried, and the roar hushed just enough for his next words to ring clear. "This court will no longer serve coin over conscience. The evidence is entered, the testimonies heard. Silas Crane, your land and wealth stand under question, and until judgment is complete, you will remain bound before the people you wronged." A cheer erupted, the benches shaking under the force of stomping feet, and Clara, tears streaking her cheeks, felt her grief twist into something steadier. Hope, fragile but alive. Silas snarled, straining against his chains, his voice ragged. You'll regret this, every one of you. Without me, Dusthaven rots." But a rancher shouted back from the benches, "Then let it rot clean. Better than living fat on your poison." The room thundered with agreement, and for the first time, Clara saw not just a mob of fearful neighbors, but a community rising, their courage kindled by shared pain and the sight of Silas unmasked. Elias leaned heavily on the table, blood still drying at his temple, his eyes locked on Clara's as he whispered low enough for only her to hear. "This isn't just a trial anymore. It's a burial, and he knows it." She nodded. Clutching Samuel's note tighter, her body weary but her spirit braced for what must come. For though Silas had been chained and shamed, his threats still hung over them like storm clouds, and she knew the final reckoning was yet to fall. The courthouse dawned quiet the next morning, the storm of voices from the day before still echoing in the beams overhead, as if the walls themselves remembered every cry for justice. And when the judge returned to the bench, his gavel struck not with hesitation, but with a weight that carried finality, his voice steadier than it had ever been as he declared that the evidence, the ledgers, the testimonies, and Samuel Vey's last words had stripped Silas Crane of all claim to land, wealth, and standing, leaving him nothing but chains and the scorn of the people he had ruled through fear. A hush fell before it broke into thunder, cheers rising, fists pounding, widows weeping as if their dead had been vindicated through Clara's trembling voice, and Elias Boone, battered but unbroken, stood tall at her side, his arm brushing hers as if to anchor her to the earth as relief threatened to lift her away. Silas was dragged to his feet, his once proud figure hunched and broken, spitting curses that no longer pierced the crowd, his voice drowned by the roar of unity. And when he was led through the doors, the people followed, not with fear, but with contempt, their eyes hard, their steps steady, as if escorting a ghost already dead. Clara clutched Samuel's letter to her chest, her tears falling not with sorrow now but with release, her husband's truth preserved, his dignity restored, his murderer stripped bare before the town he had poisoned. The judge, his voice rough with shame, faced the people and admitted the law had bowed too long to coin, but swore that from this day forward Dusthaven's court would serve no man but the truth. And though many doubted, the sight of Silas undone gave his promise the power of rebirth. Outside, the sun spilled gold across the square as neighbors embraced, long-held grudges dissolving in shared triumph, and those who had cowered in silence now lifted their heads, speaking openly of debts and land, no longer afraid to name the thefts that had scarred them. Elias turned to Clara, his eyes softer than she had ever seen. And in that moment he was no longer just the man who had placed his hand on the Bible beside hers, but the man who had carried her husband's truth, as if it were his own blood. And though words failed her, she managed a whisper that carried more weight than a shout. "You saved me, Elias, but more than that, you saved him." He shook his head gently, placing a rough hand over hers where she held the letter. "No, Clara. Samuel saved you. I just made sure his voice wasn't buried." Around them, the town buzzed with the stirrings of change, farmers speaking of sharing cattle, widows of pooling bread, men offering to mend fences and build anew, as if Dusthaven itself had taken a long, ragged breath and was finally ready to heal. Clara looked toward the horizon, the memory of Samuel still aching like a scar. But now she felt something more, a chance for her children to grow without the shadow of Silas's cruelty, a chance for her to live not as a woman hunted by debt, but as one honored by truth. And as Elias stood beside her, silent yet unshakable, she knew that while her husband's love would never be replaced, Samuel's last words had tied her life to a man who had chosen justice when silence would have been safer, a man who had shown her that courage could be as steady as stone. When the crowd carried them into the square, cheering and chanting her name with Elias's, Clara lifted the note high, her voice breaking but proud. "Dusthaven belongs to its people now." And the cry was taken up like a hymn, rolling across the plains, carrying the promise that the age of fear had ended, and that a widow's grief and a rancher's vow had together built the foundation of a new dawn. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you had been in that courthouse, would you have stood beside Clara, too? Tell us in the comments.